Hey, TCSTV viewers, it's Evelyn here from the camera store coming to you live with the TCSTV Live Dream Team. And they're working behind the scenes tonight with Drew, Gary, and Aaron. Thank you so much for tuning in for Bird Photography, the awareness of a bird photographer with Kyle Marquardt. And this event is sponsored by our friends at Sony Canada. And this is a very special TCSTV Live for me personally, because I've actually known Kyle since I started working in the camera business back in 2004. I was about 12. And it's been amazing seeing him grow as a photographer, as a nature guide, working for various expedition companies, getting published, and just as an awesome person. So I'm totally honored for this chance to host this event with him. And if you're wondering, yes, we're doing this a little bit backwards tonight. I'm at home because I've been a little bit under the weather. And so Kyle is actually at the camera store with the crew tonight. But of course, one of the great things about going live is we can be flexible and work remotely. And the very best part about it is that we have this ability to interact with all of you. So we have a couple of ways that you can ask questions. One of them, of course, is in the YouTube chat. You can interact, you can ask questions throughout the whole evening. You can also email me if you're not logged into YouTube. My email address is evelyn@thecamerastore.com. And lastly, before I introduce our guest tonight, I want to once again thank you to Sony Canada. We have some of the Sony team in the chat as well. So if you have gear questions, they might be able to help out there. We have Anthony and Stuart in the chat. And Anthony also arranged for anyone who has attended the event to get 10% off your Sony order if you order within 30 days back on a prepaid Visa. There are some exceptions to this, but if you're thinking about making a purchase for Sony gear within the next 30 days, do send me an email. Again, it's evelyn@thecamerastore.com, and I can send you some information about this offer. And last, for Sony, I wanted to mention that they are sponsoring our upcoming KEH used gear buying event. And this is a good opportunity if you have some old gear, you want to trade it in. Sony is going to provide up to 25% in an all-in bonus trade credit. And so you can get your hands on some of the new gear, like maybe that amazing 200 to 600 great lens for bird photography, or the brand new, which is in the house tonight, 70 to 200 millimeter lens. So check out all the details for that KH program on the blog. And yeah, so if you don't know our guest, Kyle Marquardt, he's a commercial and nature photographer, and he has work published in National Geographic Travel. He's also proud to be commissioned and document and promote successful land conservation projects for NGOs like the Nature Conservancy of Canada and Ducks Unlimited. And as his role as a photography guide, he loves escorting artists, enthusiasts, and photographers alike to places like the Antarctic, Antarctica, Africa, and of course the Rocky Mountains, where he finds that to be his home. So welcome, Kyle. Thanks for joining TCS TV Live.
Thank you very much for having me. That was a really great intro. That's a good deal these days. 10%? Can I have that?
It is.
Can I don't think I qualify.
I think Anthony probably could hook you up with that after the show, just for being here. But yeah, tonight we're going to talk about bird photography, and you have some of my favorite bird photos. And I like that tonight we're going to talk not only about maybe some domestic birds, but a lot of kind of more exotic birds like penguins and birds from just all over the place. So maybe you can get started. I know you have lots to talk about. Why don't you get right into it?
There's so many things. So hello, I'm Kyle. Thanks for that intro. So what's interesting about bird photography is I'm commercially trained. I started with commercial photography. I actually thought I would be photographing products and being in the studio all day. But when I started getting invited to doing travel photography, it absolutely blew my mind. So I never started off as a birder or a bird photographer, and it's something that it had to happen because birds are so inspirational. They've covered almost every ecological niche Earth has to offer. But it didn't always start that way. I was always exposed to ornithologists and biologists. And one of the best things that really got me going with bird photography is bird observation skills. So if you're not into bird photography or think you want to get into it, or you just want to be interested in the birds, but you'd rather just get the photos, well, if you want to be interested in the birds, it's really good to be able to memorize them and interpret them. So often when people first come across birds, they say it's a seagull, or it's just a bird over there, and it's small. And they have these words in their memory, and I might be like, so can you tell me more about that bird? And they say, oh, I saw it today. I'm like, okay, I might need some more information, like where is that bird? So there's some memory tricks that birders often start off with. So we might start off with, how big is the bird? Is the bird kind of large? Nope. Okay, well this one's going to be small. But how big is the beak? Is it a long beak? Is it a short beak? And what color is that beak? So that beak might be brown in this case. And what color is the eye? Okay, it's black. And what about the feet? Do they have webbed feet? Start cataloging these things in your mind. And nope, this bird didn't have webbed feet. It had tiny little spindly feet. So we know that's a lot of information there already, because we know it's not a seabird. Seabirds have webbed feet. It's probably going to be found on land. Now, what color was that? Did you remember what color? Was it mottled? Yes, it was. And where did we see that bird? We saw it in the grass. So with a lot of that information, if you start cataloging that every time you see a bird and look at every little piece, and you'll start getting better at memorizing those things, and you'll start to memorize these birds a lot better, and it feels a lot more personal. When other people are talking about birds and you have no idea which bird is what, being able to memorize them really, really helps. So here, this is a South Georgia pipit, and it's a small, round, short beak, black, beady eyes, short brown feet, brown and yellow mottled feathers, and hops around on the ground, flies like a butterfly with short, small chirps. And what birders call this, they call this the jizz of the bird. It's a very unusual word, very strange. And I like to remember it as the gist of the bird. And birders like to have this general knowledge. Often, just the movement of a bird helps me identify it. If I know I'm in a region where a certain bird is and it has this sort of butterfly-like movement, I'll just see it on the corner of my eye and I'll know what it is because I know that's the only kind of bird that will move like that. So start breaking them down into little bits and pieces and you'll have a much better time remembering these birds. And then the next mindset. So I'm going to start talking about mindsets, and this is going to be a little bit less about the regions that these birds are in. So I'm actually going to jump from region to place, all over the place. And I'm going to be more focused on the mindset and how we're thinking and what we're doing here. So I'm going to show you a bird colony here in the Falkland Islands. These are black-browed albatross. And it can be quite overwhelming when you first come across these. You have birds in the sky, you have birds below you, you're trying not to step on some, trying to navigate this unfamiliar landscape. And you have to think about where you're going to be starting. How do I know what to shoot? What is there even to see? You might be asking yourself these questions, and people are very overwhelmed in places like this. Then you want to start breaking down what kind of behaviors am I going to be seeing and what do I want to capture? So in an image like this, I might be, it's clearly that we have a nice colony here. These are gannets. These are gannets in the east coast of Canada. And I decided to have the colony take up a small portion of the front of the image and have the sky taking up the vast majority of the image. So what I'm doing is I'm being very clear about what's interesting in this photo. Yes, I have the colony at the bottom, but that's just to show where we are, but it's more about the birds filling the sky. So to the viewer, the emphasis is on the sky, so I've kept my horizon closer to the bottom. Whereas I'm having the opposite situation here, I'm keeping my horizon near the top to have the penguin colony fill most of the frame, to exaggerate how large that colony is, and just to give enough context to show the snowy mountains in the background. So I'm going to show you another little place here. This is a place called Elkafellet, and this was the first time I ever brought out my Sony camera when I got it, so please forgive a little bit of the color there, but this is not far off from how it looks. And this bird cliff is in Norway, in Elkafellet. And these are little auks, beautiful little birds. They're almost like penguins, but they've retained the ability to fly. They need to fly because they need safety of the bird cliffs. There's land predators here, foxes, bears. So they've retained the ability to fly. But evolutionary pressures have almost pushed them to being a lot like a penguin. There's so much food. There's so much food here that they're really, really fat. It's really hard for them to take off. They often crash land in the water. It's really fun to watch. And they're good divers as well. So they have some thicker bones. They're able to handle the higher pressures. And when you look down in the water, you can see them flying in the water. And they'll choose usually to evade capture by swimming away instead of flying because they're much better at swimming than they are flying. It's really fun to see them.
Kyle, when you're setting up for the wide angle mentality, like what kind of focal length would you normally recommend if you wanted to be able to capture a lot of the environment?
My favorite is, I really love 16 to 35s. Those are my favorite range. I love the ultra wide angle of 16 mils. And it is quite a luxury to get, 14 mils and things like that. But 1635 seems to be this really nice spot for me. And that was one of my first wide angle lenses, and it sort of stuck. So it might even be like a little bit of a personal preference of mine. but I've always loved my 1635s. So these bird cliffs, again, it's another very overwhelming environment. You are surrounded by these birds. And I also kind of consider my telephoto to be a bit of a wide angle, or often something that I will use for landscape shots. So if you're far enough away with your telephoto, I just have just enough of the ocean just at the edge of frame on the bottom to give you context that there is an ocean. And of course I do this with tourists and other people. I like that it expresses that by showing the boats on the bottom. But the sheer scale is quite visible here. But once you're closer, you start looking left and right, and I like to look for diagonals. I really am into diagonals in my image, and I want them to go from one corner to the other. So in this image, I see quite a strong diagonal. Oh, where's my pen tool? This diagonal here is something that I'm very into. So I like to frame those going from one corner to the other using the mountains, the cliffs, and the ocean. And of course, what's taking up most of the image is all the birds in the sky. The sky takes up most of the image. The ocean's there for context, and so is the cliff. But I usually want to have an emphasis on my image, one part that takes over more than the other, so the viewer's not confused as to what they should be looking at. Here it's the same situation. Yes, we have birds in the sky, but the cliff is the main focus here. And again, you can see that I'm gravitating towards my angles here. I really just love to split the images in half and get this nice diagonal in there. And here I'm shooting with a much slower shutter speed. I tend to just go from one end to the other with my shutter speeds. I like either capturing everything nice and frozen so the motion is caught, or really slow shutter speeds so that we got motion blur. And so this kittiwake in the Arctic here, this kittiwake is blurry, and I want that because I want that to feel frenetic. I want a sense of action here. And of course I have the cliffs taking up most of the image, but I really like that it's sort of split in half, almost like a flag. And there's interesting considerations that I do take in editing as well. What I really do love about these Sonys is the dynamic range is so good. To be able to get this highlight and shadow shooting into the sun without having to resort to HDR is such a joy. You're spending less time shooting, less time editing, and more just getting done what you want. But another consideration is I like to consider how the color, the white balance can affect the mood of the image. I like more warm and bright and welcoming images, so I tend to go towards the warm end of the spectrum, but I could have edited this to be a little bit cooler, to have a cold feeling. If I add more blues in there, it's going to feel a lot of cold. So that's something that I consider, but this is a joyful image to me, so I wanted it to feel nice and warm. So wildlife behavior mindset. So after having a wide angle mindset of taking in the landscape, watching the birds for a while, putting down my camera and actually looking at the behavior, I'll start to zoom in and really concentrate on the behavior a little bit more. So with penguins, there's some pretty exciting things that can be going on. These little Gentoo chicks, they're actually being chased by a skua, which is one of their predators. So I would watch the skua fly in, and that's when I know that I would get the action. And of course these chicks, they're tapping on the beaks. Most birds are asking for food by tapping on the beak, and that's quite a frenetic action. So if I see tapping, I'm quite tuned into that. So I might be looking the other way, but my eye's still open. If I see some tapping, I might swing my camera around because I know that someone's going to be fed soon, and that's one of my favorite behaviors and quite an interesting shot to get. And of course, they might ask for too much food and chase their parents around a little bit. One of the other interactions I really like, there's a bird called the snowy sheathbill. It's this white bird here, and they prey on the parents feeding their chicks, and they'll try to distract them and get their food as they're being fed. And remember that for later, because there's another bird that's gone around it, and I really like that adaptation. So you can see a nice mouthful of krill here. And And this one's remarkable because we have one species feeding a different species, which I've never seen before. It's incredible. But yeah, that frenetic action is absolutely wonderful to see.
Another question about lenses for this. What kind of lens would you use if you're trying to go after the wildlife behavior, something like this?
Almost always is a telephoto. Unless a bird, most birds are not coming up to me, they're not coming to my lap or landing on me like Snow White. I'm going to need to get close to them to show a lot of those behaviors. Almost always telephoto. 100 to 400 is a good range. The 200 to 600s are really luxurious. They're really nice. And they give you a lot of reach. Yeah.
Awesome. And I think Anthony brought you to check out the 70 to 200 lens.
He did.
You went?
Yeah,
which is crazy because it's super lightweight. And so if you were on an expedition, I'm sure that would be kind of nice to have something super lightweight like that.
Well, I mean, that was the draw for mirrorless. I wanted lighter gear. I wanted to be able to bring more gear in a smaller package. And that's pretty much exactly what this promises. Yeah, I just can't believe how light this is. And yeah, having lighter gear has been a huge improvement. I'm getting older. I can't lift as much heavy gear. So I've been really enjoying all this, the lightning. I've been liking that. And the performance too. Just looking at the bouquet on here is quite beautiful. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to move on to sort of figuring out where we're going to go in a landscape. So imagine we are on an island here and we're scoping it out. And we notice on the left-hand side, there's these really beautiful mountains. So I'm going to be thinking about that, where I'm going to be going. So let's say this is the place that we're going, and my landing site is on this red X, and this green path is where I can travel. Well, I know that these mountains, way off on the left-hand side, are really interesting as a backdrop. I want that as my backdrop. And all these little orange or brown spots, those are colonies. So that's what I want. I want my colonies in the foreground, and I want those mountains in the background. So all I know with those blue lines there, that's the direction I'm going to be facing. Those are the places that I can start looking. And someone might think, oh, that's really limiting. But having these limits can get rid of the distraction. It means I'm not going to be walking to the other side of the island. I'm just going to be walking to this one site, and I can concentrate here. So this is what it looks like. And this is, yeah, okay, we got some stuff going on. There's a few penguins scattered. And often when people see these birds, this is the first shot that they take. And what we just have a photograph of is penguin and the ground and mud and guano. That's not really all that beautiful. I might sound like a broken record, and my portfolio is kind of a broken record, but what I say and what I do is I try to get my camera as low as possible. Even a tripod won't be able to go as low as I want. I want it touching the ground. So I've instructed these people to try and get as low as possible. So the best way to do that these days is, of course, flipping out your screen and squatting down like this. Now, in the SLR days, I would be laying down. I would always be laying down, and that was just part of the job. You just accepted it. You said, I'm going to be laying down. You're covered in guano and mud, and I would have to hose myself off every day. And when I went mirrorless, I went mirrorless just so that I could have lighter cameras, and I didn't realize that my actual posture, my daily work would be dramatically changed, that I'd be so much cleaner because I wouldn't be laying in guano all day. This posture is wonderful for me. I absolutely love it. There's so much more flexibility. I can stand up really quickly. I can get down really quickly, or I can stand and shoot from the hip. This is fantastic. And what I learned with Sony is I changed my autofocus button to the lens buttons. I love these lens buttons. At first I didn't know what to do with it. I don't think I programmed it to do anything at first. I was just like, oh, well, that's neat. But I set that to autofocus. And because the camera is low down, I actually had a hard time using my normal pointing finger to actually take a photograph. So I'd actually use my thumb. And this posture is incredibly stable. It's really, really stable. And it's just that really, the fact that it changed my physical position was such a surprise, but it was quite a delight. So yeah, this is how I look now. And I'm a lot cleaner and my gear is lasting twice as long. So that's good. So you can see how this will dramatically affect your image. Here we are standing up. A lot of people's first instinct is to stand up, but as we get lower and lower, we get this nice background. So I'm always considering what my background is going to be and where I have to be to get that in a photograph. So I can see that's quite an improvement. And this works all over the world. Doesn't matter where you are. So this gannet colony in the East Coast in Canada, this gannet colony was beautiful, it's amazing, and I was looking at all the behaviors, but I had a very messy image and I wanted an image that was simpler. And so there was some plants and greenery in front of me, and just when you shoot at f2.8 and everything gets nice and blurry out in front, it simplifies the image and adds a little bit of extra color. I really like that it's almost like this little extra bit of Photoshop, but in real time. You just have something that simplifies the image. So when I would watch these birds, again, I get to the gannet colony, I have no idea how these birds behave. So I started watching them, and I noticed every so often they would show this beautiful display. And you get in the right position so that you can hopefully simplify the image and then wait for that display to happen again. And it happens like clockwork. So my camera's not glued to my head the first time I go somewhere. It's me observing with my own eyes, downloading images to my own brain and analyzing what's going to happen and where these birds go. Of course, puffins too. Part of the reason that I shot this image in that particular spot. There was all sorts of places to go, but you probably know by now that I really love my diagonals. I love the diagonal going right through there. Puffin here is right on that rule of thirds line. What I would have preferred is that puffin had, maybe some fish hanging out there. I'm still waiting for that to happen. And that's kind of the joy of not getting the perfect image, is that you can go back and you have something exciting to actually improve later. I'm always thinking about that. It's not really a sad thing. It's just more of a exciting thing. Like, oh yeah, I can improve it. I can do better. There might be more situations where I can get an interesting image. And again, I love being really close to the surface. So when I'm on a boat or a Zodiac, I actually hang over the side of the Zodiac. And that's also why I really like these camera straps that attach to your wrist. I don't want anything attached to my neck. I'd rather have it be on my hand. That way it's not going to be lost in the water. This is also another thing that really changed the way photography feels for me. I'm less restricted. And I could hang off the boat and probably pass out, and my camera would still be kind of okay. But
what strap is that you have? Is that the Peak
this
design?
is the Peak design. Yeah. I really like the Peak design. It hasn't failed, and I really like that it has a failure indicator, so I know that if it is going to fail, it will change to yellow and orange. Yeah, it's been bulletproof.
Yeah, we'll try to put a link to that strap in the comments. But we do have a couple more gear questions, if you don't mind. So we have a question here asking if you would prefer Sony Alpha or Canon 1DX for photographing wildlife and birds.
Well, I used to shoot with Canon, and at the time I had a Canon 5D Mark III. And the Sony A7R and the A7 III are available at that time. And I gave it a shot, and I really liked how light it was. So I moved over to Sony. So I'm currently a Sony person. That would pretty much answer that one. And like looking forward, like Sony has a really, they keep releasing cameras really fast. These cameras got old really quickly. I'm looking at the,
They have a fast cycle for sure.
Yeah, I'm looking at their new cameras, and they would be a huge advantage and quite a luxury.
Well, and then two other quick questions. One from B. Taylor. Do you ever use teleconverters to get extra reach, or do you prefer not to use them?
I used to hate teleconverters because of the degradation in quality. But now that I'm getting into video, even at 4K resolution, even if you're having like a little bit of degradation, of quality. You're not going to notice it in the 4K video. So with my 100-400, sometimes I put on a 1.4 teleconverter. I usually do that in the Arctic or in places where birds are really far away. In the Antarctic or places where birds walk right up to you, I don't worry about that at all. But yeah, I found with video, it's actually improved a lot. When you have a polar bear or something that is kilometers away, and then you turn on your 1.6 conversion, and then you add that with 1.4, you have a 2 times doubler. That's really great for video. So I found them fantastic for video. So it renewed my love of those. Yeah.
Awesome. And then one last gear question we'll squeeze in from Trina Media. Have you ever considered using Micro Four Thirds for having far reach with smaller kits?
Yeah, actually, one of my colleagues did have a Micro Four Thirds camera, and it was impressive that she had like a 70-200, but it had quite a reach because of the crop factor. I have considered them. At the time, when I was considering other cameras, they didn't seem as performant. Whereas when I was getting these, the A7R and the A7 III, I found that it was very performant. So it was an easy move there. But I never did fully go to those. But I do like having smaller cameras. I don't have a Micro Four Thirds, but I do have the A6500, just for like fun, quick little hikes. Just put a little, what do I have? A 28-135 lens on it, and it's really small, really light. So there is some validity to having a small and light package like that.
Sounds good. And of course, there are some more gear questions in here, but we'll get to those a little bit later. We have lots of time during the Q&A, but keep the questions coming. And yeah, you can continue on, Kyle.
So again, my broken record, favorite place to be, really close down to the water or the sand. This is an oyster catcher. I don't know why they're called oyster catchers. They don't catch oysters. Oysters don't run. They should be called oyster shuckers, but they don't even eat those. Here's a little crab he was eating. Actually, he was about to go up to it, and I used my flash, which was kind of unnecessary these days, given that you have such high dynamic range. I probably could have boosted the shadows with that one. And a lot of parks and places aren't allowing flashes for wildlife anymore. So it's nice that our higher dynamic range is starting to replace some of that in certain situations. And again, really down low. Often my fingers are touching the lens at the bottom, and my fingers might be dipping in the water. And that's how close I like to get, just to get that intimate angle, because anything does in the water will splash and be so much more vibrant. And of course, as I showed before, penguins feeding each other, shooting right across at them, you can get those angles that show everything. So I'm going to move over to Africa and eat a little bit of humble pie here. Often when you're first out there, you get your basic shots. You have your identification shots. You get every single animal or every single bird. But after a while you go, okay, I've got a lot of those. How can I be better at that? Can I start combining these things? And so I was trying to photograph these egrets, and again, I was not familiar with their flight patterns. So putting down the camera and sitting there and watching them fly, where they fly from, where they fly to, what they were doing is they were flying from wildebeest to wildebeest, almost like they were having fun. It was really entertaining. And I just couldn't quite understand when they would do it, and therefore I was getting a lot of misses. I was not getting the photos that I wanted. So this is one of the few images that I managed not to cull. I'm sure many of you have done this, where you've got like something like this. Everything's tack sharp, but you just missed it. I've got hundreds of these. And that's the thing about bird photography, is when people on Instagram or social media, a lot of times they'll say, oh yeah, I snapped the shot, I got this quick little image. And that makes it seem like someone just they saw the bird, they took one click, and then they got the shot. And that's not what's happening. We're taking hundreds of photos, and 99% of them are garbage. They're failures. And part of what a photographer does is we take a lot of bad photos, we just don't show anyone. We just show the very, very best. And a lot of people can get disheartened by that. So when I'm shooting birds, especially when they're flying in the sky, I've made a commitment to sitting at the computer, probably spending way more time than I actually did viewing these birds, looking at the photos, because I took so many, and there's probably only going to be one that is actually good. And yeah, okay, I got this egret, but again, after watching them, I started being able to predict which wildebeest that they would land on. And I saw one coming from the right-hand side and I thought, oh my gosh, that's it. He's going to fly and land on the wildebeest in front of me. And he did. And I got the shot, so I was pretty happy about that. Other times, you know what? You might try and shoot at really slow shutter speeds. I like to shoot a lot of action at slow shutter speeds, maybe 1/60th of a second, 1/50th. And usually when people are learning photography, they're taught to shoot at higher shutter speeds so they don't get a lot of motion blur. But I want that motion blur. I want to track that bird. So usually, if you have stabilization in your lens, mode 2, that will allow the lens to compensate for movement that is going up and down, but not left and right. So the stabilizer won't get confused. I'm usually in mode 2 and I'm panning. And these albatross, I was trying really, really hard to get these. And you know what? I never got the shot that I was looking for. This albatross was still kind of blurry. I never had one that was close enough to start filling the frame. It wasn't that tight frenetic action that I was looking for. So I just decided, you know what? I'm going to go to the other end of the shutter speed spectrum. I'm going to shoot at 1/1000th of a second. And there I was getting a lot of hits. I wasn't getting that artistic motion blur, but I was getting some interesting shapes here. As you know, I pay attention to lines. I like lines intersecting. And we have a line going all the way through this black-browed albatross and another line here with the horizon of the colony. And just enough colony to show context. We know where it is. So I kind of like those X's in there. And then, of course, I moved on to other things. There would be some of them hidden in the tussock grass, and the sun is behind you, so you can get a glint of sunlight in their eyes, and they look kind of sarcastic when they stare at you, or maybe like they're not very happy. Other times, though, we might be looking for an image that is almost entirely blurry, and it's okay. I wasn't okay with some of those albatross photos being blurry, but here it was working with the mood of the image. This giant petrel, they can be very imposing. They're actually quite sensitive birds. You actually can't get very close to them when they're nesting. So it's something that I'm probably expecting I'll never ever see. So they're so sensitive, and there's a lot of restrictions around them. But you do see them around colonies, and they often dry their wings, and they'll leave their wings out, and they look really imposing and very dramatic. And this guy seemed like he wanted to just show off how tough he was. And he was running around on this pond. And I thought, okay, I'm going to settle down. I'm going to sit on the ground, and I'm going to concentrate on him. And it was a really slow shutter speed because he wasn't moving very fast. And I was panning. And normally with birds or animals, you often want to give them room to look into. And you can see that his face is kind of hitting the left side of the frame. And when animals seem to be hitting the side of the frame, it's a feeling of awkwardness. Or it might make you feel a little bit intimidated. And that's the idea with that. And then, of course, if the bird was on the right-hand side, I wouldn't have had some of that water. He was kicking up water behind him, and you got those splashes. I wanted to keep that in there to show how much action there is in this image. So not always getting a perfectly tack sharp image. Some messy images are something that I like to oppose a lot of my simple, clean-looking image.
Kyle, we have a question here about what application you use to call your images, to edit them down to your best picks when you're shooting sequences.
Yeah, good question. It used to always be Lightroom. I always like to recommend Lightroom, Adobe Photoshop, Lightroom Classic, because especially if you're starting, it's simple enough that if you're new, you can start learning and doing things, but it goes all the way to the professional level. Lightroom is just all the advanced features that people use in Photoshop, but only for photography. So I love that it has that huge range of ability. And I also use Capture One. And for a while I was using Lightroom and Capture One side by side, especially because Capture One, it'll render the image a little bit differently, especially with Sony. It's worth just taking a look and trying a demo. Maybe you might like how the images render. What I did decide is that I liked how Lightroom rendered my landscape and wildlife photography, and I really liked how Capture One renders product and portrait photography. So if I'm ever shooting tethered, I shoot with Capture One. And Capture One is very fast, very, very fast with loading images. So if you're getting really impatient with how long it takes to look at an image, Capture One is very impressive with its speed. So if I need to be really, really fast, I might use that. But I do find the flexibility with Lightroom really nice. I'll often move from my travel laptop to my desktop. And the way Lightroom handles catalogs is very, very robust. You can make a lot of mistakes and still not mess up your library. So sometimes I might start in Capture One just for the culling, and then I'll go to Lightroom for the rest of my editing. And that's where my main library sits. Good question. All right. So these are blue-eyed shags or rock cormorants. And they have a lot of character. These are one of my favorite birds. You can see that the parents are feeding the chicks. And remember I was talking about earlier how some birds will prey on them feeding their chicks. Well, they found a way around it, and it's amazing. The chicks will ask for food by tapping and violently assaulting their parents. And the parents will acquiesce by opening their mouth, and the chick will go down into the parent's throat to get the food. And it's almost revolting, but it's just unbelievable. Oh, you can see how happy he is. But they never spill. That's like 100% efficient food transfer. And I appreciate that. I think that's really interesting. When every little calorie matters, I think that's a really interesting adaptation. So I find these guys to have a lot of character. They're so frenetic. They have a lot of action. So they're among my favorite birds to photograph at a low shutter speed. And they also fly in a very predictable manner. They fly in often straight lines. You can see them coming from a mile off. And they'll often do the same thing over and over again. So you can practice and take lots of terrible photos and then get just that one that's really, really good. So these are my favorites to shoot in these messy, low shutter speed environments. And again, I like being really close to them. And I was very lucky to get a black background here because these shags, they're also called blue-eyed shags, they'll often bathe in the water, and these two on the left and right hand side, they were shaking, and so there was sprinkles of water everywhere. And because we have a black background, the sprinkles of water will render really well. And another bird that is very important to watch. This is one that I still, every time I see them, I have to put down my camera and start memorizing how they move, because they have really beautiful movement pattern. But it's a little bit harder to track because they'll fly above water and then they'll dive down into it. And so you'll watch and they'll tip down their wings or tip up their wings and they put their head down, and you'll know after that, that's when they're going to start diving. So if you can start memorizing that pattern, it'll be a lot easier to predict where they're going to be and track them with your camera. It's not an easy pan, it's this U-shaped dip that you have to take into consideration when you're trying to track these birds. And yeah, the Arctic tern, Antarctic tern, terns are also in Canada. They're very brave creatures. They're very defensive over their nest. They will absolutely not hesitate to attack you if you come near their nest. And they're so small and cute. So I applaud their bravery. And one thing that's actually quite interesting is I like to use like quite colorful and punchy presets. And what I find is that I'll have to be very careful about their beaks or their legs looking too orange or too bright. That's another thing that also gives you a person information about what's going on. Sometimes when birds are malnourished, they might have a duller, less saturated beak. Or if it's brighter, then they might be a little bit more nourished. or they might be ready for more of a mating season. So I try to dial back the color sometimes with my oranges and reds to try and get an accurate portrayal, because I might be expressing something different by blasting the colors. But yeah, memorizing how these guys move and ends up getting you some very dramatic images. So image series. Yes, we're talking about bird photography, but you might be taking other photographs as well. You might want to start thinking about what else you can be photographing. Can you get a photograph of a particular species' favorite food, or where they live? And when you have a series of images, if it's going to be in a book or a slideshow, you start working on how they might fit well together. As you might know, the krill is an important basis for the ocean's ecosystem, tiny little shrimp-like creatures. And I was very happy to get photos of some krill that I scooped out of the water and put in a Tom Collins glass and photographed with a napkin, a blue napkin behind it. But I was also delighted to get this skua. I really love these skuas. They're a bird of prey in the Antarctic. A lot of people might know them as Jaegers, or parasitic Jaegers. And you can see that he's eating a krill out of the water. And I had a choice here. And this is where dynamic range can actually freeze people with choice, especially when editing. I have the choice of, on the right-hand side, showing more of a silhouetted image, which was more of how it looked when I was out there. But because of the incredible dynamic range of these cameras, I could blast my shadows and show that detail. But where will the emphasis be? Yes, the bird is taking up most of the image, and I can identify this bird very easily by the shape. But I wanted the most interesting part of the image, the brightest, most colorful part of the image, to be that krill that is just flying in between his beak. That was the interesting part. And that way, when you have a montage of this bird, you know, yes, I got a photograph of this bird of prey. Birds of prey are usually more intelligent and inquisitive, so they might actually come up close to you. And yes, I have a photo of them going after eggs in a colony and opportunistically going after krill in the ocean, even though that's probably not their main food source, and flying above the colony and the chicks. Try and think of getting other photos that might mix well together with what they eat and what their behaviors are. I also like to talk about the practice of addition. And that's simply one-upping yourself, or one-upping up your images. I sort of talked about that earlier. You might get an identification shot, but how do we combine more things in our image? So yes, I have a photograph of a gannet flying, and I have photographs of them in the colony, but can I try and mix them together? Can I mix my diagonals and also have a gannet flying and some of the colony in there? Or these terns, can I get them eating something? The bee eater, the white-throated bee eater in Africa. It's such a vibrant name. It's obvious that they would eat birds. So don't you really want a photograph of them eating a bee? Yes, I do. I really want that. And I was so excited just to get something like that. So I often want to include a lot more background in my images. I want the background to at least try and express where the place is and what the environment is like. So some people might be tempted to get rid of the gazelle to make it a simpler image, but other people might notice, hey, that's a gazelle. Okay, that secretary bird is definitely in Africa. I mean, if you can identify the bird, you know where it's going to be. These oxpeckers too. The amazing thing is that they will eat all the insects off the various creatures. So you'll often see that. So when you have multiple animals mixed together, you can show their relationship. Although the oxpecker can be really creepy and actually eat at scars and wounds and drink their blood or scabs. So they used to be really cute and seen as symbiotic, but sometimes they can be parasitic, which is really creepy. And then I'm thinking ahead. So yes, we'll have a sunset. I might be able to get a silhouette shot, but do I know of a tree or of a place where birds often roost or animals often stay? Will I be able to combine my silhouette shot with a silhouette shot of this bird? I sure hope so. I don't have it yet, but I'm thinking about it. And the cedar waxwings, saw this group of them. I like to be out when we have just that last bit of sunlight and the moon is out. Can I include those in the image? Yeah, I could maybe make a composite so the moon was sharp, but I know that's the moon. It didn't need to be sharp for me. I like that it has that depth. A lot of people often ask me, what apps do you use? What can you use to plan these things? A lot of people use photo pills. I really like Sun Surveyor. It's a little bit simpler. They have this section with photo opportunities. So it's really easy to start lining up with your calendar. My favorite time of day is when they say, oh, it's a full moon with the sunset and the moon is going to be low on the color changing sky. I really like that. Those are really great times to be out to incorporate the moon with your subjects. So I really like that app for that. And if you are struggling to identify these birds, the Cornell Lab has these free apps, Merlin and BirdNet. Merlin does everything. You can actually upload your photo and it'll try and identify the bird. If you put in extra identifying information as to where it is, where it was, and what time it was, it'll get a really good ID. It can also ID by sound. So what if you don't even see the bird, but you can hear it? And you kind of want to go after them. You're out in the forest, and you want to figure out what that bird is. You can record the sound, and it gets quite accurate results. And that's really nice. I really like using the sound identification. So one last thing is composite techniques. I sort of came across this technique kind of by accident. I guess it was just, maybe I should have known. But as we're out there, when we're shooting birds, I'm always in burst mode. So I'm always going, taking one photo after the other. And the idea was just to get, one photograph of just the bird. And what I started realizing is that this was kind of shot like a panorama because the images were overlaid by about 25%. And I really like the panorama feature in Lightroom. It is very user-friendly, very easy to use. And it's part of why I always need Lightroom in my workflow. I can't fully go over to Capture One. And yeah, we can assemble this image. And what's interesting is the same bird has been multiplied in the image. So when you're talking about this, or if you're writing something about this image, you have to remember that this bird here is the same bird. Ooh, there's my pen. This bird here is the same bird as this one. That's the same bird. It's just been multiplied. And a lot of people have done that on purpose, but I kind of didn't realize that I had this huge catalog of photos where I've taken so many photos. And I've sort of gone back in time, years, and started making panoramas with them and started getting really interesting images. These guys had fish and squid in their mouth. And because they're panoramas, they're so high res. So I can zoom in and get a lot of detail. So images that were normally just square or rectangular end up becoming panorama shaped. Just make sure you admit that this is a composite, because that's what it is. It's a composite image. And I often use this to get a wider angle shot. So what if you don't want to change your lens and switch to wide angle? Well, I can start assembling these images in Photoshop and Lightroom, and you got this time composite that's much wider angle. So I really like that when you're zoomed in, say if you have a prime lens, like a 400 mil, and you're stuck at 400 and you need a little bit of extra room, the panorama feature is really, really good. Often I'll have an image in my mind. I'll see something and I go, oh, you know what? I need that. I need those birds. I want a lot of negative space and sky in there. And you quickly take the shot and you go, oh yeah, I have my telephoto on. It's not that wide angle. I can't get that shot. But if you think about it, you go, okay, well, I'll just quickly take another photograph of the extra space that I wanted in the image. And then that image that I imagined, you use your panorama tool, combine those images, and you got all that negative space. Really useful for getting photos that work for magazines or titles. That negative space is so useful. You'll see a lot of that in my imagery. And with that, I think we can go for more questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, so we have some questions just about autofocus for birds. So this is from Lucky Jack. Can you talk a little bit about what are the benefits of one type of autofocus system? I think maybe he's referring to like how do you set up your autofocus to track birds? What do you like
Yeah,
to use?
it's a good question. Some of it might have to do, there's the focus area. You might want to think about that at first. Um, if you know how good you are at keeping the bird in the middle of the frame, you might have seen some of my video footage where I was good at that and where I wasn't. Um, if I'm very good at tracking a bird, say the blue-eyed shags who travel quite straight, and I'm in a very predictable situation, I will use center autofocus because I'm very confident in my ability to keep the bird in the center. But if I'm not, then I'll start switching to either zone or wide autofocus. I found that to be quite impressive in the Sony line. Often if I'm just getting a little bit off kilter, it might still pick it up. So that's the other consideration. If I need a little bit more leeway, it might be more unpredictable if we have a wider area for it to focus on. But yeah, I'll change the focus area to wide. I'm almost always using continuous autofocus, and I turn the animal autofocus on as well. Once they added that feature, you are more likely to get a eye in focus, and I usually want that part in focus. And especially if the bird is like, say it's a white bird with a black eye, it's just like, it's very reliable. But almost always continuous autofocus, simply because often the birds are flying towards me and that they're changing in my plane of focus. Continuous autofocus almost all the way. And because I like to use back button focusing, because I've disabled the focusing button on the shutter, I have to make a conscious decision to turn on the focusing. So I'm using another button, which is the lens button, to tell the camera to start focusing. That way, it's almost like single shot. Single shot is different in that I believe it uses different algorithms. I think it does a little bit extra longer time to focus in single shot, but single shot is also a little bit more accurate. Anyone can correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, I almost never use single shot because
Why would you?
because why would you? They're moving. They're
Why would
moving
you?
so
Don't do
fast.
it. Don't do it.
I mean, yeah.
Another technical question just about your priorities, Kyle. So Andrew Gregory wants to know, what do you prioritize more, lower ISO or highest shutter speed? And he's from the Philippines.
Cool. Oh wow.
Yeah.
It really depends on the situation. Sometimes I can have some very overcast situations. It's surprisingly dark. It's interesting to have a camera outside in the wild because what your light meter is telling you at certain ISOs can give you a really good indication of how bright it is. And it can be like many times darker with an overcast situation. But I'm not worried about noise. If that's what you're worried about with ISO, I don't really worry about noise anymore. I remember with some of my older cameras, I only like the noise from ISO 100 to 400. But now I'm pretty comfortable with the noise from 100 to 1000 ISO because it's so surprisingly noiseless, and then our noise reduction tools are better. So from the noise perspective of ISO, I'm not really thinking about it. To the point is sometimes I'll shoot in auto ISO. So I'll go, you know what? I don't care what the ISO is. I'll set my auto ISO to 100 to 1000, shoot within that range, and then I'll pick my shutter speed and my aperture. So I'll be in manual, and then I'll let it decide the ISO. I'm not thinking of ISO as much as I used to because I'm not worried about noise or degradation in quality with such a huge range. It's quite luxurious. So I hope that wasn't too much of a general answer for you.
No, I think that's good. And I have to agree that I like to set my ISO to auto and then have more control over shutter speed and aperture. And Yeah, it gives you a little bit of just comfort that you know that you're going to get a little bit of that extra helping hand while you're shooting.
And when that
Um,
feature came out new, it was like, it was magic. It kind of changed photography. You never thought that way
totally.
before.
So we had a lot of people from Alberta, from our home province tonight. And there's a question from Ken saying that all your examples seem to be from exotic locations, because that's a lot of the work that you'd normally do. But do you have any favorite birds or locations in Alberta that you like to shoot?
With Alberta, my favorite places are ponds and sloughs. And if you're from Alberta, you know what a slough is. Um, um, those usually the dirtiest pond is among the best. And usually you kind of have to ask people like what are the best. There's an area in southern Alberta near Payne Lake. I won't tell you where it is because it's private land. But it's funny, there'll be all these little ponds, and a lot of them are really nice, beautiful ponds with beautiful views of the mountains. And the birds don't give a crap about that pond. But there's this one pond that is just, everyone calls it Bird Pond. It is bonkers out there. Oh my gosh, what is my favorite? So you think my favorite thing in the world is variety. If I see one thing too much, like at the end of like a 3-month Antarctic season, I don't want to see another penguin again. So I'll sort of get into one thing or another. Starlings are kind of like my benchmark for camera performance because they're so hard. They're so hard to photograph. They are usually you find them under bridges. There's a bridge under Waterton. If you're going to Waterton, the bridge right into the park. If you can park a little bit away from the bridge, there's always these starlings there. And what you can get is sometimes they'll land in the water, and the water there is really still. So you might be able to get them actually still for a while with reflections and mountains in the background. But it's hard. It is hard, and I actually don't have what I want yet. But I go to Waterton a lot. So it's kind of one of my little benchmark spots that I like to stop at. So yeah, there's only one bridge, so you'd probably find it just outside the park.
Good. And just to add, if you're in the Calgary area, I think one of the most popular places for people to photograph birds and sometimes other wildlife is Carburn Park. You often see a lot of photographers in that area, and it seems to be a good nesting ground for a variety of species. So maybe check that out too.
Carburn Park,
Another question
Pine
here
Park.
from Ariette is, I like to photograph birds on the water like the Bow River. Very much a beginner, and the issues often glare otter too much, maybe under certain lighting conditions. Do you have any tips on any settings that you can use or tips about avoiding glare in your shot?
Well, that's interesting. I've found glare to not really be too much of a problem, but usually when I do have, so say if you're shooting into the sun, and therefore you have all these sparkles of sun in front of you, and you have a bird there, and you probably would have a lot of glare. One thing that actually did help me a long time ago is when I first started getting cameras, I would use UV filters, and they are really good for protection, but it's yet another piece of glass or something that adds to distortion or that gets dirty. I've stopped using UV filters. I still have them for all my lenses because there are situations where you want to protect your lens and it might be really, really messy, sometimes in the ocean. But there are times where I will take off my UV filter, and I think that it actually does improve some of that haziness that you might get, especially if you are shooting into the sun. These guys, lens hoods, I love having lens hoods. Not only do they prevent glare if the sun is coming in the side, but they actually keep the lens way cleaner, really, really clean. You can shoot in the rain and you're probably not getting anything in there. So I always shoot with a telephoto using a lens hood. And then with exposure, I don't know which camera you're using, but with Sony, See, when I was shooting with Canon, I'd actually shoot more to the right and more overexposed because I could bring down the highlights. But with Sony, I'll be shooting underexposed to make sure that whatever's really bright or really highlighted still has details. You'll see in the back of the camera when your highlight warning is on. I turn on the zebra stripes so that I can see if something's going to be overexposed. Love those zebra stripes. I did have to calibrate my zebra stripes to get it kind of accurate to what I would get in my raw file. And when I started doing that, I had to underexpose a lot. So a lot of my images looked very dark before I processed them, and they absolutely required to be brightened up. But my highlights are intact because I've shot a little bit darker. And then of course I can bring back my shadows because there's so much shadow detail. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think so. So we'll get to a couple more questions before we wrap up tonight, Kyle. So from Leslie, how about using a tripod in bird photography? Do you use any specific one?
I found tripods to be very, very limiting. Even with, I tried out like one of those nice swingy, Wimberley has a lot of fluid motion. You can loosen it up. But I found that this, especially when tracking birds, this kind of motion was much easier to do while the camera was attached to my head, looking through the viewfinder. That extra freedom of motion, moving my torso, becoming the tripod, worked a lot better. If I was to use a tripod, perhaps I might be looking to photograph, do a long exposure, maybe of a colony. Actually, I've tried to get a lot of long exposures of colonies or groups of starlings. I haven't really gotten what I wanted out of it. It's kind of a blurry mess. But yeah, I found tripods to be very, very limiting. So it's kind of come out of, it's kind of left my repertoire for bird photography, especially because when my camera's on the ground, it is quite stabilized. Sometimes just having this part on the ground is good enough. Yeah.
And then there's a question here. I don't hear you mentioning the 600 millimeter prime lens. Do you not find it very useful?
Oh.
But I think I know the answer.
I don't have the 600. That's why I don't have it.
We would all love the 600 millimeter lens. It's a very amazing lens. Very
useful. We would all
but,
really like that lens. And at the same time, I'm often after the environmental portrait. I don't always want to fill the frame with a face or with the entire bird. I try to incorporate the background or the foreground in there. And particularly when you get to go amongst colonies, when you get to go close to wildlife, those lenses can be kind of a hindrance. They can be so heavy, you can only bring so many lenses with you. And when you have something that's just like 3 or 5 meters away from you, you kind of don't need it. But yeah, absolutely, I would use the 600. And I think about it all the time. And I'm like, you know what? I'm spending most of my time here in Alberta. A lot of the birds are really far away. Maybe I should.
Yeah, or that 200 to 600 is actually a really nice lens to get that reach and not quite as lovely as the 600, but yeah. And the last question we have for you before we kind of end things off is any thoughts about photographing hummingbirds? I've been shooting them for a few years and they've had a hard time getting the perfect hummingbird shot. Any tips on that?
Do you know what I want to do? I was photographing hummingbirds this summer. Obviously, I'm fairly certain that you have a hummingbird feeder, which makes things so much more predictable. That, and you might have control over, if you have flowers, like the really pretty ones with the actual, like, really realistic looking fake flowers on them, you'll have a lot of control. So I imagine you're doing something like that. But I have been thinking, because we've been seeing more of them, I would like to get one of those infrared laser triggers that where you could just leave your camera set up on a tripod. Hey, there's a good use for a tripod. Wait for you have everything set up, have that hummingbird trip the laser, and the shot taken automatically all day. I think that would be really fantastic. I would love to experiment with that. I'm also thinking about a lot of my older cameras and setting them up as camera traps. I would like to do that, but I haven't done that. But I think that's the next step, because you can.
I think you might have inspired Kyle to go set something up at the cabin or something like that. Well, thank you, Kyle. This has been really interesting, and I hope inspirational for everyone to just get out there and photograph birds, do lots of practice, lots of trial and error. And of course, thank you to Sony Canada for sponsoring. If you've registered for the event, we will send you a link and a survey to a Sony collection of equipment to get you on your way to photographing birds. And of course, we have lots more TCS TV live events coming up all the time. And so you can head over to thecamerastore.com under the events tab to check out what we have up next. Or you can just subscribe, hit the notification bell, and you'll be notified whenever we go live here on our YouTube channel. And yeah, thanks again, Kyle. I hope you enjoyed hanging out with the TCS TV live crew.
I appreciate it. Oh my God, these guys are so much fun.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm sorry I couldn't join you there, but I'm glad we can do this virtually so that I'm not getting everybody else sick. So yeah, I hope everyone has a great night, and we'll catch you again soon.